You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Rebecca Midles. This week, I've been thinking more about the why and the how of transforming education. The why is evident. Our world demands more from our young people. They need collaboration, problem solving, and adaptability to thrive. But the real challenge is always the how. How do we move from a system focused on seat time and standardized tests to one that supports future facing personalized learning? That kind of shift requires a coherent process to connect a district's vision to the daily realities in classrooms. As we've seen in our Getting Smart Innovation Framework, state policy is a critical link. That's why I'm so excited to talk with the team from KnowledgeWorks today. We'll dive into what it takes to build a coherent system, one where policy and practice work together, and not just talk about broader outcomes, but to actually make them possible. I'm joined today by Jon Alfuth, Senior Director of State Policy, and Julianna Charles Brown, also known as Charlie, Senior Director of Systems Transformation at KnowledgeWorks. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
When you think about the future facing our young people, what does a learning system look like that prepares them for that future?
Well, what I love about this question, and one of the things I love about working at KnowledgeWorks, is we actually have a team of something called futurists. So
Yes,
before I
you
came
do.
to KnowledgeWorks, I didn't even know a futurist was the thing. I might have reconsidered that history degree had I known that.
Same.
But our team of futurists do something called a forecast. So every 3 years, we put out a forecast into the future of education, and it really scans what's going on in the world, what's going on in education, and how do we think what we think is going to happen in the world is going to impact education, and then what does education need to do to be ready for that. That's actually been a practice that we've had for over a decade now. And it's really one of the things that led us as an organization to commit to student-centered learning models, personalized and competency-based learning, because we know that in order to prepare young people for a very uncertain and rapidly changing future, they're going to need to be equipped with skills that can transfer to a lot of different types of scenarios and situations. So what we call transferable skills, competencies. We know that systems that are equipping young people with those skills are going to better set them up for a very rapidly changing future.
Yeah, thanks. And Charlie, I think just building on that a bit, what does that system look like? It really looks like a system that engages students, one that creates more personalized learning opportunities for them, one that really allows them to be more prepared with more real life engaging experiences for that future. I think we're seeing right now, unfortunately, schools aren't necessarily going in that direction. There was an OECD survey recently that looked at over 80 countries and found that almost half of all students agreed that school has prepared them for adult life. Same survey found that less than half of students were being connected to workforce exploration experiences. And then life trajectories are just changing too. So we need a system that is recognizing that not every single student is going to follow the same paths maybe they have traditionally. If you look from 2019 to 2024, you get a significant decrease in the number of students going right into a 4-year post-secondary institution and about a doubling of students going right into a career path. So again, I think our education systems just really need to think about how they can restructure to acknowledge that this is the reality that students are starting to face.
Great points. I'm just going to insert here a shameless plug for what Charlie mentioned. The futurist work at KnowledgeWorks. If you're just listening to this and you don't know about it, that's the kind of conversation we're surfacing today. But that activity can be done at the district level, at the school level. And it had a huge impact on me the first time I did it. And sometimes I just read the papers and sometimes I went through the actual experience. So wonderful to think about plugging that in here as well as we talk about what the systems need and what we want for our young people. So you just talked about changes and transformations. What are some of those that K-12 education need in order to get to that future? What are some examples or what are some ideas around that?
Sure. I think kind of going down to some of the detail level, and I think Charlie can talk a bit more about some of like the higher level concepts that run through all of these things. But I think a lot of the reason, and this is something that I see too with the students I coach and my own kid, is that the structure of K-12 education is built for a very different time. You still have students that are largely moving through classrooms in this at the same time every single day, 180 days in the school year, long summer breaks in the middle. Our general high school course structures are pretty much all the same. They're still based around the idea of the Carnegie unit. which ultimately assigns you a letter grade that may or may not actually tell you something about what that student actually knows and is able to do coming out of that class. For the last about 20 years or so, I forget exactly when No Child Left Behind was passed, we've really been basing our whole structure of accountability around either very narrow measures like math and reading scores, or thinking, more about measures that can be standardized across the state, but don't necessarily reflect those needs of maybe individual communities. So I think for me, it's, how do we really push ourselves to think differently than how schools are organized, what students should be able to know, and then how we're going to track that and how we're going to figure out whether students are getting that knowledge. And then how do we make sure students are making progress towards that vision? Charlie, I don't know if what you want to say about the broader kind of overarching themes that run through some of that.
Yeah, well, and I think, John, you're really talking about what does it look like to change school in service of a different common purpose, right? And I think that when we and in fact, the first area of our state policy framework really addresses this idea of common vision, because what we know when we talk to young people, and this has been true for years, is that when we ask them, you know, what would you want to walk out of school with? What are your goals for what you could do here with your education, right? They are not often talking about accumulating credit hours. They are talking about a higher purpose of being prepared for life. And when we really dig into that, what that looks like is being able to communicate, being able to collaborate, right? And so you're going to hear me throughout the course of this conversation today talk a lot about transferable skills, because what those skills represent is a rethinking of the way we talk about the purpose of education, right? Because right now, as John was kind of mentioning just now, all of our systems drive towards a purpose of accumulating credits aligned to discipline specific coursework, right? And I'm not saying, and I don't think anybody in KnowledgeWorks would ever tell you that discipline specific coursework should go away. It's not a good thing to do, right? The disciplines are a fabulous way to understand and to structure our understanding of knowledge. However, when you talk to young people, and in fact, when you talk to their parents, and when in fact, you talk to their future employers, and when you talk to their pastors and their sports coaches, they're not talking about accumulating credit for discipline specific coursework. It's about these larger skill sets that we know that young people need. So we call those competencies, but what those competencies represent is is a different shared purpose for education. And I think just really starting there is such an important way to start the conversation. And from that, what we know is when you are orienting to a different goal, everything about what you do has to change. And so it's almost like a Pandora's box where it's like, well, if we agree that the goal is for every young person to walk away with a set of, 4 to 10 highly transferable skills, every single thing about the way we structure school could change. And I think that could be like an overwhelming statement, but I want to frame it as an invitation. It's actually really exciting because you are getting to a point where young people aren't asking you why do they have to learn something, because everything they're doing is aligned to those skills.
So true. So we're talking about systems change, and I have you here to talk about your policy framework. So let's talk about that. Let's move into that piece. How does that support schools and districts like you're sharing in moving towards that level of systems transformation?
Just on a real tactical level, when we talk about the shared purpose concept, what that looks like in a policy conversation is how you set the goal for an education system. So our framework really begins with this common vision. But what that looks like on a tactical level in a policy situation, and the most common way we hear it referred to, is states establishing something called a profile or a portrait of a graduate or learner, right? And what that is the community gets together. They say, hey, what do we really want young people to walk away from our system with? And then that gets articulated into this picture of what it looks like for somebody to graduate from that system. And from there, what you can do is you can take each one of those. What they typically are is an articulation of a transferable skill or a super important high value understanding, and like a communicator, like civically responsible, right? Like these things that are like, wow, if young people could do that.
Right.
And then you break those apart into something called competencies. And then you talk about what it looks like to achieve that at an early elementary level. You talk about what it looks like to achieve that at a middle school level, what it looks like to achieve that at a high school level. And that's what a competency learning progression, right? So all of that is actually policy, what we might call little p policy. And then when you ladder that up to state policy, the things that start to get impacted by that are, well, how are we assigning credits based on achievement in those skills? What's the relationship of those things to our standards, and how do we want to deal with that? Do we want these things to exist at the state level, or is the state framework a model and your local community gets to establish their own versions? You start to get into some really interesting big P policy conversations when you're aligning to that shared vision.
Do you have a stance on whether you say profile or portrait, or does it matter to you? As KnowledgeWorks to you?
What matters to us is that it matters to the community, right? So what resonates most with your learning community is going to be the right thing to call it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I know I've heard some communities argue they like portrait of graduate or profile of a graduate because it speaks to the high school element. Other communities specifically like profile of a learner because then it's not just high school focused. So, I think it really is, it's contingent on who we're working with. But I think zooming out for a second too, like Charlie, you were talking about some of the tactical things that we include in the framework. And this whole framework is actually our third iteration of this. The first one, I believe, was out in 2018 or 2019. And this predates either Charlie or I at KnowledgeWorks. And then it was updated pre-pandemic. So this is the third version of it. So it really draws on several years of direct state policy work in the space. And I think if you had to boil it down to kind of two different concepts of what it advocates for, it's policies and then implementation steps that either reinforce what that vision is that Charlie was articulating, that profile and the competencies, or removes barriers to achieving that vision. And there's probably some that overlap in both areas, but functionally it's about how do we set up a structure that reduces the hoops that schools and districts have to jump through while still maintaining guardrails where it's reasonable to put them around innovation, but also really empowering them then to take the initiative and figure out how can we create these meaningful learning experiences for their students. So, if I can just take you briefly through the framework, some of those things, we have that system purpose that Charlie was telling you about. I think at KnowledgeWorks, we're not just about competency-based learning, but we have a personalization element too. So flexible learning pathways, I think, is a huge part of that, both for, it can go all the way elementary through high school, but those tend to appear a lot in high school space. We also really emphasize the importance of policy flexibilities that empower those districts to innovate. And then making sure that your measuring systems with accountability and assessments are capturing those things that really allow schools to, again, make that progress towards the vision, but are also empowering communities then to implement those supports that are helpful in the classroom. And then, of course, educators are probably the most important part, I think, of the system, because they're the folks that are implementing this work on a day-to-day basis. So how do you make sure educators are prepared, are constantly updated, are supported as they're doing this, making sure that students have the support structures that they're going to need in place to take advantage of opportunities. And then again, making sure that funding is there, if it's funding to support the growth of innovative practices, making sure that schools and districts aren't penalized if they try to innovate. Those are really the 8 different policy conditions that we have in here. And I think the last thing I'd really emphasize too, about our framework, and Rebecca, you can definitely dig deeper on any of these if you'd like to, but is that unlike our previous iterations, we decided this time to not just classify it as a policy framework, but it's really a policy and implementation framework, just to reinforce something Charlie was saying. So I think what we've seen is that, implementation matters just as much, if not more, than policy. You can have the best flexibility waiver in the world, or you can have the most generous grant program. And if people don't know about it or don't know how they would use it, there's absolutely zero guarantee that they're going to actually leverage that opportunity. And we could definitely give you example after example of that. But again, just to really reiterate the point, the implementation, I think, is a crucial thing. So we really try with this framework to differentiate between those two as much as possible, just so folks could see it's not just about the legislation, about the statute, about the regulation. It's also about the structures you put in place to make sure that those opportunities are there and that schools and districts are supported to take advantage of them.
That's great to highlight. I know before in other iterations, you would often talk about the way it was meant to be used, but it's great to see them coming together in this format. And we have a link in our show notes for people to find out more information about the KnowledgeWorks policy. If you want to see the visual, you want to go to the sources, we have the link in our notes. Thank you for sharing that piece and the implementation. It does make me think about the crossovers that we've all talked about before this call today about our innovation framework, as well as how that really aligns well with the policy framework and how they complement each other. You guys have had a chance to look at that. What were the highlights that you saw for crossover, or what ones would you want to share?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there are a lot of things that directly connect to elements of the framework. I mean, community vision, that's essentially our system purpose. And
I was hearing.
we had a lot of conversations about what's our stance going to be on statewide portraits of the graduate. There's 20 states, about to be 21. I think actually as of recording this episode, it's 21 because I think New York has officially passed theirs into law. But our position that we essentially took is we think it's valuable for states to have a model portrait, but that allows communities to either adopt that or they can create their own, because we've really seen the power that comes. I think Charlie alluded to this, in states or in communities creating their own vision. So like that is I think an absolutely huge connection. I think one other one that I would emphasize, and then Charlie, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, but is that learning ecosystem, just really having those broad ranges of opportunities, whether it's in the building, whether it's outside the building, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, that allows students to really explore things that interest them, but also allow them to make, again, going back to that vision, that progress towards both academic knowledge and then those higher order knowledge and skills. So, Charlie, what about and there's other connections, I'm sure, but what sticks out for you?
Absolutely. And I think the one that's really coming up for me, again, I'm going to go back to those old transferable skills. But when we look at the community vision piece, and then we get to the what, right? So we've got our why, which is our community vision, and then our what, which is our outcomes. We're talking about, thinking differently about our what, which not just, math content knowledge for the sake of math content knowledge. It's like, yes, absolutely still math content knowledge, not saying no math content knowledge, but like in the service of being able to think deeply and process information about the world and solve really big problems. And so to just get really bold and really ambitious about the outcome of what a system can be. And then from there, I think a really cool piece of this framework is that strategy layer, or what you call, I think, is strategic implementation. So Jon walked us through the 8 policy areas and mentioned that we are talking both about the actual policy as well as implementation moves. And I see that as a connection between what you've articulated there as strategic implementation. Because again, if we're not thinking about how somebody is going to actualize an innovation, a policy, a flexibility, it's not worth it to have the policy itself. And I think what's also interesting about that is the way we're thinking about policy systems that are responsive to what's happening in the field, right? So what I like about both of these frameworks is it could create a common language between lots of different constituencies, right? The one that I'm thinking about right now is those folks who are working to implement the field and the policymakers themselves, right? Like let's use these frameworks so that way we can work more effectively together. Another group of constituencies is policymakers that are working across contexts, right? So let's use these frameworks to organize our conversations so that way if you have a framework that provides you a shared language to organize your conversations, you can get that layer deeper. And that just allows a lot more effective, efficient collaboration across layers of the system, constituencies across contexts. And so I feel excited about all the alignment between both of these frameworks and the conversations that they're going to allow people to have in the field.
And Rebecca, if I can jump in with one other thought really quick, I was just scanning back over you guys' framework, and one thing I think, and you all have done a lot of great work on this, is that whole signaling element too. So taking the frameworks and the structures that Charlie was highlighting, how do you actually communicate this in a way I alluded to in some of my opening remarks, the report card, the A or the B, like what does it actually tell you about what a student can do? It tells you, I know when I was in high school, I was that kid who I would say, all right, I'm going to do the bare minimum to get that 90%, which was an A in my school. So I remember going into one of my finals for my senior year and knowing exactly the percentage I had to get an A.
The game.
Yes, it was the game. So it can tell you that a student can game the system, or it might tell you something about their knowledge and skills. But I think for us, we're starting to take this framework and thinking about how do we apply it much more broadly to areas like, for example, high school transformation. We're currently doing a 6-state network in partnership with the National Association of State Boards of Education. And the whole idea of signaling has come up frequently with a number of our states, both in terms of how might you design a transcript that communicates this information, but also how could we even start by assessing those skills and then signaling it through things like state accountability systems. So this feels like a really important element of that framework that I can see you all grappling with and us also grappling with. And it's going to be even more important as artificial intelligence tools to do assessments and being able to personalize learning become more and more prevalent in schools.
Right. Yeah, I was hearing a lot of that too. I mean, I definitely heard that in the opening with the why and how. I loved when you were just mentioning the signals piece, John, but also Charlie, earlier when you said the big P, little p, you were actually referencing that in context of the what and the outcomes, which is so true. And so I love having that connection being made for people who are well aware of our framework and maybe you don't know KnowledgeWorks. It's just a great compliment to see those connections. We just love showing that partnership that we all embrace easily. One of the things you also mentioned that I wouldn't mind making a point of, John, you talked about making a stance of the state portrait work. I know that we, not too long ago, were able to collaborate and support a state that had intentionally set up a portrait with questions and then had partnered with you guys to align competencies with that made space for people who had already had a district portrait of a graduate or a school that already had a portrait to find themselves within those open-ended questions. It's one of the few examples that have done that, I think, in Nevada. That was really, I think, helpful for people to see, because sometimes I think people are reluctant to do a state portrait because they feel like it's too much time has passed, right? There's too many districts that have them already. It's going to be interesting to do that. And so I thought that was a really unique way to do that, and just wanted to highlight that work too, because it made me realize we hadn't talked about that. But along that line, with the portraits that you've done and the state work and the competencies you set up, how do you think people are redefining those outcomes to include skills like so often mentioned today: communication, collaboration, problem solving, adaptability? What kinds of policy shifts are necessary for states to recognize these broader outcomes?
I think one of the very first things that you're going to run up against is that this concept of or relationship to standards, right? So right now, our standards frameworks are the articulation of our goals for learning. They are how we align all the systems of crediting, which ultimately lead to your credentialing, which ultimately leads to, your assessment and accountability measures. And so I think it's actually a potentially under explored area of the conversation, right? I think people always want to jump to assessment and accountability first. And those of you that know me, I'm more than happy to talk about assessment and accountability. And I think aligning those measures are incredibly important. But if we're not talking about the goal first, right? Like the thing we're trying to do first, you can measure the wrong thing 6 ways to Sunday. If it's not the thing you actually want your system to do, then it get really tricky. And tactically, that's a really complex conversation because the open secret about standards frameworks is that they are not standardized, right? So like every content area may have a different set of standards. Of course, there are some national frameworks that a lot of states have adopted, but different standards frameworks treat the organization of their content differently, right? And so you might have domains and subdomains, or you might have skills over here and critical understandings over here. And so I say all that to say is that when we talk about transferable skills, they may already show up in your standards frameworks. Like some frameworks have math practices, the NGSS, the National Science NGSS standards have like scientific practices that are what we might call competency like. But if you as a state are saying, okay, we got our portrait over here we've articulated like 5 to 10 things that we want students to do. Our standards are also sort of articulating those things in a different way. And then just put all that in front of a teacher and you're like, good luck, teach it all. It's like teachers are like, come on, how am I supposed to make sense of all this? And so I think there's like a real lot of nuance in parsing that out. And I think it's something that we see people kind of dancing around, but I'm really excited to see like a state ambitiously say like we're going to really tackle this problem and figure out how our standards and our competencies align. So if you want to do that, give us a call.
Sounds
Yeah, and just building off of that, I think I would 100% agree, Charlie, that the first step really is articulating that vision for what you actually want your state to do. And I think every one of these pieces in the framework, I think we'd say is important. But I think the next step would probably be thinking about how do you reinforce that those things are important. And this is kind of a catch 22 what I'm about to say, I think, because accountability is the number
Mhm.
one mechanism by which states reinforce that structure. And the reality is that there's a certain limitation given what's currently in federal statute around how states can actually innovate within that federally mandated accountability structure. So I think that goes back to Charlie, what you were saying, that it's all about how do you support and how do you track and how do you calculate, figure out essentially how districts are making progress towards that vision. Now, I will say that some states that we've come across are maybe looking below either the accountability structure, thinking about things like graduation requirements, which states really do have a lot more control about, and then thinking about things like how do you structure those in such a way that it incentivizes a district to maybe approach how they're doing their high school structures differently. Or even within accountability systems, some states are thinking about how do we maybe make a parallel system to our state system that really reinforces a more of a locally driven accountability approach that is more meaningful to communities. And we can definitely go in some examples of that, Rebecca, if you want to get down to that level. But I think the last piece, in addition to once you got the vision and the accountability, would really say like flexibility to innovate. And that's probably that currently called policy flexibility in our framework would be huge. So kind of the approach that we take, and I don't know if we've said this yet, but we designed this framework, if you go and you check it out, to be more aspirational versus
Mhm.
previous iterations of our framework were a bit more like prescriptive, like saying you would go
Mm.
from point A to point B to point C to point D. This is saying if you go all the way to Z, what would it look like? And if you want to know how to get there, that's something we could definitely help work with you on. I know many others could as well. But so where we got to in the policy flexibility is kind of this twin approach of making sure that you have statutorily protected flexibilities that schools and districts have in many of the areas like calendars, start dates, instructional minutes, credits, all of those things where a district can say, cool, I can go ahead and do this. But then you also have, I've been calling it a safety valve, a statutorily protected innovation opportunity, where if a district says, okay, we're still bumping up against this barrier, we can do 90% of what we want to do, but we just need this one, waiver from this one particular provision, having an opportunity to get that. And then I think that last part, and this is Charlie a lot what you do, is that feedback loop, which we call in here a regular state policy audit. So making sure you're having that dialogue with communities so that if there really is a policy barrier that folks are bumping up against as a state, about that, and you can take appropriate steps to either help people understand it better or potentially address it and change it if that's what's necessary. And again, not to deprioritize any other areas, but I think those are the ones that we would probably collectively highlight as being most impactful to achieving those desired goals of innovation that we are talking about.
Yeah, I hear you also talking about the rethinking policy that enables flexible learning environments and pathways, right? Like, I mean, I think that's where you were headed. Would you have anything more you to add to that? I know I was asking about broader outcomes, but I moved just now on you onto flexible learning spaces. Is there anything else you would add in that piece?
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting. We've done this series of resources for, I think we're on 7 or 8 states now. Most of them are public, a couple are still in progress, but we call them innovation guides. And it's essentially a merger between stories of districts that are innovating, but also what are the policy flexibilities that empower that innovation. And a lot of what we see whenever we talk to districts that are doing this at the high school level is, to go back to your question, Rebecca, flexible learning pathways play an essential role in that innovation. There's some districts that come to mind. You have, like, we came across a district in Pennsylvania that essentially had virtual learning programs so that students that wanted to do other things during the day, like semi-professional, it's not the word, like high-level amateur sports, could do that practice during the day, and they could do a virtual self-driven learning experience in the evening hours. Or you'll have districts that are thinking about how do they get students onto, say, a farm to have those kind of experiences. And that was in our Pennsylvania Innovation Guide, which is available online through a group called Remake Learning. But and fundamentally, yeah, and another barrier that we've seen come up with things like flexible learning pathways is just an idea of scheduling and graduation requirements. Is that a lot of districts have certain requirements, and those requirements don't always leave a lot of space for students that want to take another pathway to engage with those opportunities. So we're not currently working here, but in my home city of Washington, D.C., we're currently going through a process to reimagine the graduation requirements in the district. I think the hope being in part to create more opportunities for students to explore learning pathways that are more meaningful to them. And then DC also does have a competency-based flexibility waiver that could allow students to explore a graduation pathway or get a credit through a competency-based course. So, I think that's how some of this ties back to that flexible learning pathways piece. Charlie, anything you want to add there?
Can you restate the question for me? And then I'll sound brilliant.
Yeah, we were talking about flexible pathways and policy changes that needed to happen in order to support that work around learning environments that are flexible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, maybe I'll say it like this. I think with regard to flexible pathways, one of the things that often really comes up when you have these conversations is the implementation aspect, right? So it's not necessarily like a big P policy barrier that's getting in the way. It's some of the things that you don't even think about. I was actually with our friends in Southwest PA the other day talking about their personalized learning goals, and district leaders there were elevating transportation as like a key challenge, right? We want to be really flexible, but like how do we get kids to where they need to be? And so from a state policy perspective, that's not a policy, big P policy barrier, but what can you do in order to ease the sort of glide path towards flexibility? Do you have working groups where, like they have in Southwest PA, where district leaders who are trying to get this movement going are working out the problems like transportation? Do you have maybe transformational learning grants like they have in Montana, where it's helping districts design what they want to do and then apply for a learning grant so long as it's aligned to transformational learning? And again, because I think, where rubber meets the road is, sure, you're allowed to offer really flexible learning environments, but then when you actually go to do that, it's a lot more complex, I think, than people might realize on its face.
I'm hearing some themes. You've mentioned some states. If you don't mind, let's move into some samples or some examples that you might share. Some might say exemplars of what states are doing this at a high level that you could highlight for us.
Yeah.
Don, do you want me to start?
Sure, we can maybe go back and forth. We can
Okay.
pick our spotlight states. I won't say favorite states, but our spotlight states.
Well, I would double click on the work that Montana is doing, A, because I was just talking about them, but B, because they're really, as a state, moving in a lot of really interesting directions. So in addition to transformational learning grants, they are doing some work around their statewide assessment. They actually have a first in the nation federal assessment waiver. So not through the ESSA provided IADA or Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority program, but actually just through a blank, like a waiver, they were able to redesign their statewide assessment system. And that work is ongoing. But I think what's really exciting about the way that Montana is thinking about this is they're seeing it all as connected, right? So what we're learning from the implementation of our assessment may inform how we're supporting transformational learning. And so I think that work is really exciting. It's exciting to see where they're going to take that going forward. John, passing the ball to you.
Yeah,
and let's just do one more. Sorry, let's do one more example, and then we can put more examples in the show notes too.
Well, exactly. So I'm going to say this example, Rebecca, just because it's you and you happen to live there. But I've been talking a lot about Washington lately. So, I think Washington is a great example of a state that is has long been advancing mastery-based learning and is continuing to do so. I'm oversimplifying it, but it's a state that started with a working group a number of years ago that was legislatively mandated. That led to a statewide mastery-based learning collaborative network with a few dozen school districts that are really working to implement this work around the state. The state's put together a model portrait. They have a waiver opportunity. They have flexibility in their grad requirements. There's been consistent state funding over the years. So, I would say Washington hits a lot of those policy conditions that are in our framework. So, and again, they just made another investment from the state legislature this past year. Washington's also doing some really interesting, innovative things. It is, I think, one or two states, maybe, I think right now, the only state that I've come across that has a legislative mandate for a process to put a statewide mastery transcript potentially into play, which is something that our friends at the State Board of Education are currently working on. So getting back to the whole idea of how do you scale this and how do you catalog it. So yeah, Rebecca, I
Wonderful.
hope I said enough good things about Washington there.
Well, I love that we ended on that note with Washington. So, no, I think it's great that you put that in. And we'll have more, as we said. If people are listening to this podcast and they want to hear more of these wonderful exemplar states from Jon and Charlie, we'll have those there. Obviously, transforming education isn't just about large ideas. It's about building the systems that make them real. We're hearing about how the policy plays into that, practice and community, how they all come together. We're going to continue to explore that for every learner and what comes next.
I don't know if you've ever had the tables turned on you in the Getting Smart podcast, but we may have a few questions for you. Okay, well, good news.
Yeah,
This is a lightning round. So I've got 5 questions for you, and hopefully the answers are going to be super easy.
Okay.
Ready? What is your favorite competency?
Anything about civics.
Civics. I love it. Okay. Would you rather go back to the classroom and be a classroom teacher or be the leader of the U.S. Department of Education?
That I'd rather go back to the classroom and be a teacher.
I thought that might be your answer. Who is the person that is inspiring you most right now?
My daughter and her achieving past any goals that anyone ever set for her.
I love that. Congratulations to your daughter.
Thank you.
What is the best thing you've seen in a school in 2025?
When students have made their voice heard to the point where they've walked out, this is probably not something I want to recommend for everyone to do, but when students have walked out on a policy change and made their voice heard and done it in a peaceful, productive way, I've been not only inspired by what systems can do, but how they help set us up as a country.
That's beautiful. Looping back to civics. I love it. Okay, and this one should be very easy. What is your favorite part or the part that jazzes you up most about the Getting Smart framework?
I love the fact that it's written at a big enough grain size. It's based on about 25 to 30 years of experience and work of myself and others that have been involved in it. The fact that it's written at a big enough grain size that everyone can see their work in that framework and see where their strengths are and what they need to do to move next. I feel like that has been a disservice for systems to not know and to be able to assess where they are and then go out and seek partners that we might recommend or put in lists or show and say, hey, here's somebody like you guys that would really help you on state policy work. And giving them the tools to just own their own transformation, navigate that journey in a way that's respectful and supportive.
Amazing. Well, thank you for engaging in this lightning round. We really did surprise Rebecca with this. So we're going to get asked after the podcast.
Charlie, can I throw one
already processing all the questions I should have asked you now.
Wait, I want to throw in one more. I'm curious.
Okay,
John. Okay. And Mason, you can chop this up. Other than Getting Smart, obviously, what is your favorite must-read / must-listen to education newsletter and or podcast?
Well, I don't do enough of those, but FLC out of Michigan has just started a podcast. It's really fun to have local leaders. As far as newsletter, I do love the updates that I get from KnowledgeWorks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.